this is exciting. I'm a distillery I've not been to is Glenwyvis, and I'm super excited to be joined by Matthew Farmer, distillery manager. Matthew, is that right?
Yes, although we only
Yes.
have 5 employees, so it always sounds a bit grander than it is.
I think you're doing yourself a disservice there. There's a lot of responsibility on those shoulders, sir. Where were you? Where were you before?
So I've been all over the place. I have about 20 years worth of America in me, which is why
Right.
the accent is increasingly indecipherable the longer I go. I was born in Scotland. I went to America, and actually that's where I got into distilling. So I've been making bourbon and rye for about 10 years, and then it was
Nice.
actually Glenwyvis and the lure of the Scottish Highlands that eventually brought me back home.
Nice. How is that then? I mean, I don't. There can't be many that have worked in both industries, right? I mean, I know there's one of the guys who's gone over to Tamnafullen was working over in America. I think he was actually at one of the Canadian distilleries. There hasn't been many, I don't think, that have done the switch, right?
There's not a huge amount. I do know there are some people back when United Distillers and stuff was a thing, like the grain distilleries had a lot in common with the big bourbon plants. So you'd have people jumping back and forth. But as far as like single malt Scotch and small batch distillation, there's not a huge amount of cross pollination there.
Yeah. Because I mean, I find, especially having been over to the States, I love bourbon. Actually, I came in to whiskey through cocktails, so bourbon was actually my first love, and it was in a time many years ago when Blantons and Pappy Van Winkles and Eagle Rares and Cheat George T Stags were products that people were not that interested in, to be honest. And I was whizzing them up in posh Manhattans and old fashions and just sipping away after work because no one would drink them. It feels like things have changed a little bit, and you've probably seen that working in the States, the rise of bourbon.
Aye,
Yeah,
aye, the days you could find a Pappy Van Winkle in a state liquor store for
yeah,
retail price.
yeah. Because the 10-year-old was sensational, and it wasn't expensive. It was good. Yeah,
No, I was very much the same way actually. It was rye Sazeracs and stuff. It was
yeah.
the rye whiskey that really got me sort of like hooked and clicked into it. And it all spiraled out of control from there.
Yeah, the rye that got me into rye was Rittenhouse rye from, I think it's
Yeah.
Heaven Hill, and they, oh man, we had it in the rail in the bar, and I think we were getting it for about 15 quid a bottle at the time, and it was just good booze. You know what I mean? It worked in everything. You couldn't break it. Good on its own as well. Tasty stuff.
Hi. It was a steal. Have you tried the Pikesville? That's kind of like its
Ah,
bigger brother.
is it? No, I haven't. No, do you recommend it?
It's really, yeah, it's 110 proof in a bottle. So it's,
Right.
yeah, I have to be a little bit careful with it. But it's basically the same, as far as I know, it's the same mash bill, same distillery, but it's 6 years old minimum. And it
Right.
just has a
Okay.
little bit more. Yeah, really good.
Brilliant.
I
Great.
should be
Oh,
talking about Glenwyvis here. I'm starting
I
to
know. I
like
know. We've ended
sell
up
other
talking about
products to you.
bourbon. Well, look. So when did you start at Glenwyvis then? Like, what? How did you end up there? What's happening?
So I've been here. I just hit the 2 years here.
Yeah.
So really, it started off here. The previous distillery manager, Duncan, he was a old school Diageo. He'd had 30 years of experience in the single malt distillery. So I owe a lot to him. He sort of like came in, set everything up, got our spirit cut points, our mashing, all that kind of stuff. So Glenwyvis really is imprinted by him first. And then he sort of left to do his own thing, and I had invested in the distillery back in the day as a
Got it.
crowdfunded project. I don't know.
Yeah.
That's a whole other story to talk about.
Yeah.
But my mum was from Tain, and so this was kind of like a local story. She'd bought me shares in the distillery as sort of like a birthday present. And I got my little certificate. I got my T-shirt. I own the Scotch Whisky Distillery. I was one of those people in America. And then I was getting the newsletters, and they said that previous distillery manager was leaving and they were looking for a replacement. I had distilling experience, and my wife and I just had our first kid, and it was COVID lockdown. And I think we're probably not alone in it, but I think during lockdown and COVID, it just sort of made you think about what was important and where home was, and made you what was really the priority here. And within a couple of months, we were on a plane in the middle of a lockdown, trying to get our PCR tests and everything. And I started 2 years ago.
Well, that's right. I mean, when you have children, what you need to do is move house and get a new job because life's not complicated enough with one child. You know, is that?
Yes, immediately.
It is. We were the same, and you know, it's funny because I think when we look back in 10 years' time, with hindsight and go, how did COVID impact you? So many people I know, I'm included in this, made massive life-changing decisions during that 2 year period. And I think a lot of it was born of that kind of reflection, like where do I want to be, what do I want to do, how do I want to live, all those big, massive questions that sometimes you know what it's like when you're working, you're just too busy to even sit down and actually consider any of those kind of options, right? You're just doing day to
Yeah.
day and just getting by.
It just like doesn't even seem possible with what you're doing, and
Mhm.
then all of a sudden you're presented with like just a month of forced inner reflection, I guess.
Totally, totally. So rather than going out running 20 miles a day, I sat and considered my life options. It's spent 4 hours doing that instead. So you ended up kind of near back home then, almost, I suppose.
Yeah, I grew up mostly on the West Coast, but I still have family up here, so it was
Mhm.
interesting coming back and getting the connections. And Inverness was always sort of like the big city that we would come to.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
now we're right in the middle of it, and it's been interesting coming back because I was 14 when I left. So coming back
Hmm.
as an adult, with all the responsibilities and stuff that entails. Um, but we ended up, the hilarious thing is we ended up moving like relatively far away because we couldn't find a place during lockdown particularly easily.
Yeah.
And so I've got like a 40-minute commute. I live in Drumnadrochit. But
All right.
everybody over here is like, a 40-minute commute. That's crazy. What are you doing? How do you survive? Like, I'm coming from America where it's like an hour and a half in rush hour on a freeway. I'd much
Yeah.
rather spend 40 minutes on a Scottish country road than an hour and a half with my air conditioning on.
Yeah, so it's so true, isn't it? Because people do they commute so much more over in the States and Canada, and for us, everything needs to be a bit more convenient. Everything's kind of a bit closer by and stuff. A big commute's it's definitely something people want to avoid. 40 minutes feels very reasonable. I'm sure you've got a lot of very good whiskey podcasts to listen to on your way over.
They're right around the 40-minute mark as well. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's very
no,
convenient.
yeah, exactly. It's very handy. That's funny. And look, that's a great part of the world. We've talked about it. Mitch and I have talked about it a lot. The Northeast Highlands, if you like, almost a sub-region within the Highlands now, where you've got so many. I mean, proper brilliant distilleries make great whiskies that people around the world recognize as really high quality, and there's a few in there as well that they've yet to discover. Talk about Balblair's not that well known, but great whiskey. You know,
Mm.
your Wolfburn's right up there as well, and then Glenwyvis. I mean, we were just chatting just before we started recording, and it was actually Julie Hamilton I saw writing a really nice post about Glenwyvis recently, just about how she found it. She loved the soft malt notes, a little bit tropical fruit possibly coming through as well. I just remember from reading her kind of tasting notes, and she was kind of raving about it. And yeah, it's another distillery in this area that is bashing out some really good whiskey.
Yeah, we are definitely in good company up here. And
Mm,
with the added pressure, I think, on top of that as well, because you've
yeah.
got so much to pull from. And you also know that these distilleries, they're getting the barley from the same place, they're getting the water
Yeah.
sources from the same place. Like the thing that makes them special is the skill and tradition that's gone into it. And
Hmm.
so suddenly you can't just say like, oh yeah, our water is really good, so that's what makes our whiskey special. It's like everybody's water up here is amazing. So you've got to really,
Yeah.
the bar is set so high already. I'm sure
Yeah.
like if you're in Germany making beer, you probably feel the same way. Like it's
Well,
just
that's right. Yeah, yeah, exactly. You're making pills now, and your water's got to be a certain quality. Then you're all saying kind of a similar thing in some ways. But in that part of the Highlands, I mean, there's so many more things going on, isn't there? There's really unusual distillery setups. Talk about flat top wash stills and weird and wonderful
yeah.
things we covered off recently at Dalmore. But you go up to Glenmorangie, where you've got the big giraffe neck stills. What then? When you arrived at Glenwyvis, like what kind of caught you, I guess, and made you realise that Glenwyvis doing something quite different, quite unique? Is there a few areas that in production that are quite special to what you guys are doing?
Yeah, I think one of the big things that really struck me, and one of the reasons that actually sort of like brought me over to Glenwyvis in particular, is because the distillery I used to work at was getting a little bit bigger, a little more corporate, a little bit bigger. And as a distiller, as an operator first, the idea of being able to touch every single part of the process was really important to me. And at Glenwyvis, it is set up perfectly for that. We really only have one full-time operator, and he mashes, he distills, he does the quality check of the final spirit. you're able to follow it all the way through. So you're not, if something goes weird on one end or something isn't quite right, like you just have this holistic approach to making that final spirit. And all of that spirit is going into a cask for a single malt whiskey that is going to come out with your name on it. It's not
Yeah.
like this much is going for a blend, so we can run it a
Yeah.
little bit hotter, a little bit faster. I think
Got
it's
it.
sort of just that the scale and the size is a type of distillery that you're starting to see now, but really has not existed because I think the cost benefit ratio of having something this size hasn't really paid off in the past.
Got it.
And it's like really special. Like we have a half-ton mash tun. If you ever see it, it looks like a tiny. It looks like a toy mash
I was
tun.
going to say, is it as small as that? I knew it was small. I didn't realize it was only half a ton. That's
Half ton, yeah. It's like I think it was the smallest that Forsyth has ever made when they made
Is
it.
it? Just be like a wee ball pit, won't it? It'll be.
It is, yeah. It's like you can't even. There's no There's no closed space stuff because you can't even get inside it if you wanted to. It's incredible. It's
Yeah.
so, but it's because of that. Everything else has been kind of scaled down in proportion. So we've got a 2,400 liter wash still. You've got a 1,700 liter spirit still,
Yeah.
which I think would even come under. I don't think that comes under a different. We wouldn't even be allowed that size of still before the regulations changed back in the day.
Yeah. Yeah. Too
So it's
small, almost
actually,
a smuggler's a smuggler still.
yeah, I
Kind of,
forget what the
yeah.
actual number was. It was like 1,800 hectoliters,
Yeah.
18 hectoliters, I think. But yeah, anyway, it is a craft distillery first and foremost, but it's set
Hmm.
up in the same tradition as a much larger distillery as well.
Yeah.
And we do some weird things with that. Like we do very long fermentations. It's very cold up here, especially during the winter. So
Yeah.
the water coming up from the underground, like we set our ferments very, very cold as well.
So when you say a long fermentation, standard usually is 55, 60. Most distilleries would sort of say that. What's a long fermentation for you guys? Is it 100 hours or
144.
is it? It's really long then, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so 6 days. So we do four long of 144, and then our
Hmm.
one short fermentation is still 96 hours.
Okay,
Um,
right. Brilliant.
so
Yeah.
short is relative for us as well.
Because there's definitely a fruitiness in the batch two that I have in front of me. And a lot of that fruitiness, would you say, would come from the kind of early stages then? Is that where a lot of that's being created?
If you ever get a chance to come up here and stick your head in a fermenter, like it will hit you full on, like it's
Right.
unmistakable. It's that red apple kind of pear drop, just
Yeah.
like esteriness. And so the goal is like, are to take that flavor and somehow make it survive through the distillation, through the
Yeah.
maturation, through the cask, and sort of shine at the end of it.
Yeah.
It's a young whiskey, so it's really shining through right now. But my real hope is
Mm.
that even by the time we get to 8 or 10 years, that is still sort of a character that we can point to and be like, right, that's what Glenwyvis tastes like. Like you're not going to confuse that with anything else.
Yeah. There's a clear point of view on like the style, the house style of Glenwyvis. You guys have got that, like, you know what you're trying to create. It's funny because I think a lot of new distilleries, a lot of smaller distilleries. I'm in Edinburgh right now, and Holyrood just springs to mind. It's just across the way. I don't think they would be able to articulate to me, a house style because they're making 5, 6, 7 different spirit styles. Some are peated, some are not, some are long fermentation, some are short. Making lots of different things, which is cool. And that's as a new distillery, that's exciting. There's loads going on. You can create lots of different sort of ideas and new tunes, I suppose. But that's not what you guys are looking to do here at Glenwyvis. You guys are looking to create a Glenwyvis identity flavor wise.
Aye, definitely. So, I
Yeah.
mean, the vast majority of our time is spent. The new make coming out of us is pretty much always consistent. We do one peated run every year, just to sort of like for a few weeks as an experiment. But the difference is sort of like try and make this one spirit that shines with this character. And then, yes, we are putting into a lot of different casks and wood types to see how
Yeah.
that flavor goes in different directions.
Mm-hmm.
But I think even with this first batch that we released, we made a decision to put just a little bit of refill hogshead in there. And it's a 3-year-old whiskey. Like putting a refill barrel in a 3-year-old whiskey is not necessarily your first choice. But we found that just sort of like getting that character to come through, and then that gives us maybe a path forward where every release that we do now, yes, we'll have different cast makeups and different types, but if we just add a little bit of that refill, if we add a little bit of that character in, we'll be able to create that kind of backbone.
Yeah, yeah. I honestly, when I read it, I saw because it's on the label. You've been very clear about how you've made this whiskey. It's got 60% bourbon, 25% Oloroso, and 15% refill. And it's a lovely mix, and it works very, very well. And you said this earlier. It's about this just balance, isn't it? Really about giving that spirit the opportunity to really, really come through, and it's quite clear how that does come through. Delicious. And this is batch two. I've got batch one. What was the difference between batch one and batch two?
Batch one was pretty much, we had a very, very limited retail release, but it was really for our shareholders. The people who had invested back in the day were promised a bottle of 3-year-old whiskey when it was ready.
Yeah.
One of the big differences that we had 2 Muscatel casks that were sort of a little bit of an experiment. Didn't really have enough to be a bigger batch, and I think what we decided to do was sort of like build the blend around them and make it a little bit more unique and special, so that people who got that first bottle will have something that will never be repeated. So it was still probably, I think it was 80% bourbon first fills for that, 15% Muscatel, and then 5% refill hogshead. And that sort of informed what we were going to do with batch 2, which was a much bigger, wider release. Still 8,000 bottles. Again, big is relative when you're talking about us. But
yeah, totally. And see when then a distillery comes of age and you've got whiskey for the first time, as the person who's looking after that, it must have felt pretty good.
Yeah, it was also quite stressful, I will say, because suddenly you've got it was the one thing that bourbon and rye never really included, was this marriage of different casks, because it has to be in a first fill barrel every single time. So there was the Excel spreadsheet for putting together your bourbon batches was actually pretty straightforward. It was like, okay, what's the age, and put them together. And then over here, it's like suddenly you've got all these different cask types, to the extent that is almost overwhelming. And you've got to find some way of shortening it down. And I remember the first time sitting down, it's like, what do we even, how do you even start? There's not even a recipe. There's never been a Glenwyvis whiskey before. So what are you even working it from? You're literally just sort of going through the barrels and trying to, it's the Dr. Frankenstein lab, right? You're pouring it all together and trying to work out where to even begin. And then you have to start making it better from there.
Yeah. That is the tricky thing, isn't it? And it's when you go into some of the old distillers in Scotland, and there's loose recipes. I think there's products that have always gone into certain things, and there's general styles, and some of it's written down and some of it's not. Depends who you speak to and things. But you're right. There's kind of something to go by coming in, especially from a different industry, and going, right, okay, there's so many possibilities, isn't there, with refill, first fill, sherry, first fill and refill. Well, European oak. A lot of people think sherry casks are all European oak. It's quite the opposite. Very few are European oak. Most of them are American oak. So then you've got that. You split those apart. You've got first fill American oak sherries and refill American oak sherries.
Yes.
And then the same again on the European oak. And then people are like, all right, yeah, the sherry casks are all the same size. It's like, well, actually, no, they're not. You've got sherry butts and you've got sherry hoggies. So there's another variable within that. So you've got the wood types, the sherry types, the cask size. It's like, boom, 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 boom. The multipliers are quite ridiculous, and I'm sure a spreadsheet with all that on it might burst your brain.
Yeah, and then of course I came in with maybe just enough bourbon knowledge to be dangerous. So I'm looking at the first fill bourbon barrels, and I'm like, oh, okay, that's a Wild Turkey one, and okay, that's a 12-year-old Elijah Craig right there. And so I start adding extra columns to the spreadsheet that weren't there before. And at some point, I had to be like, okay, I have to stop. It's
but I love that. No, honestly. It's so interesting. That's why we're chatting about bourbon, obviously, at the start. I absolutely love that, because where I've worked in the past, last 10 years has been with White Mackay and Edrington. And both businesses, although they do it differently, both are massive into sherry casks in slightly different ways. And Richard and Greg over at White Mackay, big on wine, the quality of the sherry, the quality of the port that was in there, and they're quite happy if that sat in a Solera system for 30 or 40 years, so long as the cask is, bringing something to the table. Brilliant. And there's so many different variations within that are available to them. Now at Edrington, it was all about oak, and actually sherry seasoned casks. So sherry would go in for a couple of years, take away a lot of the tannins from the oak, and then we would get the sherry casks over at the distillery. And so I think we would spend a lot of time talking about sherry casks. and almost no time talking about the origin of bourbon casks and the condition of those bourbon casks and how they were treated when they were in America.
Mm.
Even things like charring levels and stuff like that was kind of skimmed over a lot of the time, just from my own sort of experience. So it was so nice to hear that, and actually just hearing you chat there more about Elijah Craig 12. Oh, brilliant! I know what I can do with that. It's going to give me this, this, and this. It's like I don't think there's that many people in the industry who've spent enough time on that, possibly. And I guess maybe it's because of volume, right? It's going to be pretty difficult to do that at scale. But the operation that you guys are running, very possible to be really selective on what bourbon cask you work with, which is quite cool.
Yeah, we can like look at each one individually, and I think you're starting to see it. I know, like I feel like it used to be like bourbon and rye casks were just sort of lumped into like is a first fill American oak barrel, and now people are starting to pay attention to okay, at least the bourbon and rye are separated.
Yeah.
And then the difference between a bourbon cask for Jack Daniels that has been used for 4 years versus like a 12-year-old Elijah Craig. Like, yes, they're both first fill bourbons, but there's an 8-year difference between what has been taken out of that wood, and that is not nothing.
No, totally, and it doesn't mean one's better than the other. It's just about what you use them for, isn't it? It's how you use them. That's the game. So what's next then for you guys at Glenwyvis? So batch 2's out. Are you going to continue to release batches? What's the kind of frequency moving forward for that?
So what we're trying to do is vintage style releases, at least until we hit our 8 to 10 year anniversary and can start thinking about maybe like a flagship repeated product. But up until then, looking at the warehouse, like we can't really repeat a product too much. And also we kind of don't want to, because what makes us special is that we can take that time. We can treat every single cask individually. So next year's release will also be a 3-year-old 2019 vintage. And then we'll probably have a 2020 vintage, but then we'll be able to rotate back around to 2019 and start bringing out a 5-year-old. Do a few years of that, we could rotate back, start bringing in an 8-year-old. And then by the time we've rotated back and we've got a 10-year-old, we can hopefully start thinking about a recipe. But it's sort of giving people a little snippet into our progress as we go. And no single batch will be exactly the same as the other one.
Cool.
Looking towards next year, I've already feel like I should have done more work on it already. The time is flying by. I don't know how it's November already. But looking at the cask makeup, like we literally don't have enough Oloroso sherry hogsheads to repeat this exact recipe. But what we do have is a lot of like Muscat red wine casks. And that'll be really interesting to look at and see how we can tweak the recipe, sort of like make those integrate into the blend and do something special with them.
I've actually got one question I'd love to ask you is, hearing a little bit more now about the distillery and the scale, I didn't realize quite how small production you guys are running. Brilliant. I love that. And you talked about it as being more of a farm distillery. I guess your peers, are you kind of looking to kind of Daft Mill, Locklee? Are you guys in the same sort of kind of, I guess, with the same philosophy, a similar philosophy as one another? Do you kind of see it like that, or do you see yourselves as just doing your own thing and not really kind of watching what other people are doing?
I think the big difference is that we don't grow the barley here ourselves.
Got it, right.
So it's a cattle farm. They eat the draff, but it's not a grain farm. But I think the philosophy is probably kind of the same, where it's a bit more of an all-encompassing kind of like holistic approach. Like we have a biomass boiler, we have renewable energy on site, draft goes out to the cows, sort of things feed into each other. And it's more about, it does kind of harken back to like how distilleries used to be on farms, and it was sort of like fed all the co-products, all the byproducts had a use. Versus everything being sort of like outsourced third party. You still end up using a lot of like out contractors and stuff for repairs and maintenance. Like we're not in there doing our own boiler maintenance or anything, but
totally. Everyone's got about 9 trades. Who's the coppersmith? Oh, that'll be me. You were you're the cattle farmer. Okay, he does everything.
Yeah, but it's sort of I think we all share kind of similar philosophies, where because when you're such a small scale, like you can just be a little bit more integrated. Like everything just sort of feeds into each other, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Maybe
No, I
waxing a
love
bit
it.
philosophical there, but
No. But I think you need to have that, and actually, I think sustainability, like in terms of longevity, in terms of being there in 100 years' time, and it's how you set yourself up to do that. And what I love, I've been chatting to quite a few new distilleries recently, is there's not this like burning ambition to be the number one malt whiskey brand in the world or anything like that. In fact, quite the opposite. It's no, we want to do it because we love it. We want to do it to a scale so that it provides jobs that are sustainable, that will last a long time, and we want to do it to make great whiskey. And it's brilliant because there's not this like kind of corporate push and I'm sure the shareholders in these businesses that would like some return at some point, but that doesn't seem to be driving everyone, which is really really good, and hopefully that remains the case. And I think that's coming through obviously from what you guys are doing and the distilleries I've already mentioned with Locklee and Daft Mill, and I was on a call actually, recording with the guys at Port Elise Distillery as well, who are who are a wee bit further behind you guys. They're not producing quite yet, but they're not far away from it now, and it's so exciting just listening to them. And their limitation is interesting, similar to yours. You've got your mash tun is the bottleneck. It will be at most distilleries. It usually is, and theirs will be quite similar. The problem they've got is that they're confined by the tower because they could only get a certain amount of space, so they're building everything above one another. So
oh
just
wow.
put in they can't just put in another mash tun or another set of stills. I mean, they're going to be restricted massively just by the building that they're in, but they're cool with that. It all sounds like everyone's sort of thinking about that, not worried about expanding and like I say, becoming the number one whiskey in the world. Just as I'm tasting this, it's got a lovely creamy texture,
Oh,
doesn't it?
thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's
yeah.
the
I'm a big one for texture. We don't talk enough about it in whiskey, but a whiskey that's at 3 years old has this lovely kind of coating. Almost, I was eating yogurt covered raisins yesterday, and it's got that lovely little sort of coating, which is really, really pleasant, delicious.
yeah, we're able to do it at 46%, actually 46.5, which was
Mm.
a nod to the bourbon because it's 93 proof, which was some of
Yeah,
my favorite bourbons. But do it without chill filtration and everything, sort of like check all the boxes, and just sort of leaves. Yeah, it has a character to it. It doesn't taste particularly youthful. It's not that sort of like chemical kind of dissolving kind of
no,
astringency. I was pretty surprised by it actually.
because the maltiness comes through very well.
Yeah, you can really taste the grain. I mean, I think people are getting more used to younger whiskies. I think 3 years is still something that it's maybe a bit more of a curiosity sometimes for people. But
Yeah,
then when they
yeah,
taste it, they're like, oh, you know what? I could sit down and this could be an evening drinker for me.
yeah, yeah. No, there's no doubt about it. Brilliant. No, it's a great effort. It's so interesting to hear more about Glenwyvis. And I was laughing to myself earlier because I always think of Ben Wyvis.
Yes, you're not
but
alone.
yeah. Does that happen a lot? I wanted to ask you that because that distillery it disappeared in 1977 or something, didn't it? 78, 77. A long time gone now, but it was once upon a time a set of stills that ran. Was it inside Invergordon, wasn't it? I think.
Yeah, so it was in Dingwall until 1928, I want to say.
Hmm.
And then it was basically a brand off Invergordon bottled under the Glenwyvis name until they
Yeah,
finally stopped producing it. Um,
yeah,
so the name Glenwyvis was a combination of Glenwyvis and then also another distillery that also closed in 1928 up in Edmonton called Glenskieth. So take Glen and Wyvis and sort of like mash them together into
yeah.
a copyrightable name that doesn't infringe on anybody else.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Let's not upset any lawyers in the process here.
yes.
That's exactly, yeah. So I didn't realize, okay, so it's a combination of the two distilleries in the area that are no longer there, and obviously reference to the big hill that sits behind you all.
Yes,
Yeah.
Glenwyvis is actually
Yeah.
it is one of the least easy to silhouette mountains. Like I think when we were first doing our bottle, we were like, wouldn't it be really cool to have like a big silhouette of Glenwyvis on the bottle or something? And then actually it's a nice mountain, but it is a bit of a shapeless kind of like lump. It's very
Yeah,
obvious.
it's not the most dramatic. It's not the most dramatic. I know it's not like if it was Mount Fuji, right? Which everything that is
Yeah.
around Mount Fuji has Mount Fuji on it because it's so distinctive. I know what you mean. Ben Wyvis is not like we've tried to take pictures of it many times with distilleries behind it. We used to go out into the water and into the Cromarty and try and get a good picture of it and stuff. And actually, it's just like, nah, you're gonna have to draw it and do it post production or something. Yeah.
We ended up doing it was we took the contours off the mountain instead and sort of like stamped them onto the label to get that little bit of heritage in there.
Yeah. I love that. Brilliant. All right, mate. Well, look, really nice to catch up with you, and it's a really interesting story you've got. Brilliant. Coming over from America and obviously over the last couple of years taking control of Glenwyvis and running the distillery there, and really interesting to just get a bit more insight into what's happening. And the whiskey is absolutely delicious. So we'll keep following the journey. When will the next release be out then from you guys?
Should hopefully be aiming for May or June next year.
Yeah.
Bit dependent on supply chains right now, but we've got pretty much everything in line for it, hopefully. Fingers crossed. I shouldn't have said that out loud, but
yeah, totally. But people can keep in touch on social media, right? So at Glenwyvis on Instagram, and I take it's www.glenwyvis.com on just the website. People can sort of find out what's happening there, buy bottles and stuff probably as well, which is great. Yeah, brilliant, mate. Thank you so much for your time.
Great, no problem. It's been a pleasure being on here. That went very fast, actually.